I just had the experience of reading about my own death.
Oh my.
So it's on my mind.
Well,
more than usual.
I'm going to ask you a question about it today.
Okay, good. That's a perfect introduction to my memoirs.
Thank you both for entertaining me.
Please.
Okay. In somewhat of a surprise, Ron Paul won the strawman poll at CPAC last week. He has said about the United States foreign policy, "I believe our founding fathers had it right when they argued for peace and commerce between nations and against entangling political and military alliances. In other words, non-interventionism." And one of your heroes, Thomas Jefferson, insisted on entangling alliances with no one. How would you respond now to Jefferson and Paul? And do you think Jefferson would have a different stance if he were alive today?
No, I'm with Jefferson on that, though not with Mr. Paul, or what I imagine his interpretation of that would be, because Jefferson was anything but an isolationist. Jefferson actually believed the United States should be an empire. It didn't have the connotations it does then. Doubled the size of the United States by dealing with the French. Would have made Cuba part of the US along with Florida. Hope for that to happen one day. Don't know what Mr. Paul would have said about that. Let's take a present case. And what could be nicer for all concerned than for us to have a free trade agreement with the good people of Persia? Great civilization. Incomparable, actually. Tremendous resources, highly intelligent people, completely locked out of the world by a fetid theocracy that won't allow normal relations to be resumed really with any country, not just the United States, because of its ideology, because it would rather go for a warfare policy, bankrupt its people, leave them open to the next catastrophic earthquake, which is going to be in Tehran, does nothing to earthquake-proof the country, builds nuclear facilities underground, makes irrational attacks on what I would call, there's no need for the prefix Western, civilization. Made them every kind of offer we can. Come back into the fold. President Obama even said he wants the Islamic Republic back into the fold, which I don't think is possible. It's because it's an Islamic Republic that it's out of the fold. So what does Ron Paul say about that? I bet you he says President Obama joins the drumbeat for war, which of course he isn't doing. This is not a choice that we have conditioned. So just to take the most salient example I can think of from the front pages, it means that what Ron Paul says is essentially empty.
You hear often from critics of our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan that even if our cause is just, they can't bring themselves to trust the U.S. government's track record in intervening in the affairs of other states.
Yes.
Do you think that's a fair worry to have?
Yeah, I have to say in some ways I do think that, because the United States has a tendency to think short-term. A huge number of its citizens don't have really much interest in the rest of the world. Would rather talk about an exit strategy before there's even been an entrance strategy. A lot of Americans don't study foreign languages or foreign cultures at all. I shouldn't even call them foreign, international. It will take me several lifetimes to get over the ineptitude of the intervention in Iraq, especially given how much time we did have to think about it. We knew it was in our future. I blame myself in part because I knew some of the people who were advocating the overthrows that I was in. And when I went to talk to them, people like Paul Wolfowitz, very intelligent people, I would say things like, we're not going to let the Turks come into northern Iraq, are we? As they demanded that we do as price of a northern front. We're not going to sell out the aspirations of the Iraqi Kurds for self-determination in order to just reproduce a Sunni minority regime. And got quite good answers to all that. What I should have been asking was, does the Army Corps of Engineers know how to turn on the power in Baghdad? But I didn't think that was my job. I thought my job was, so to say, ideological, matters of principle, things of this sort. It would seem to be insulting to ask someone at the Defense Department, have we brought enough bottled water?
Right.
Well, I should have been asking that. Have we told off a detachment of Marines to guard the Iraqi National Museum? I would have felt a fool sitting in the Pentagon giving orders or making... But I should have done. Or somebody fucking well should have done. And so that's a very sobering experience. So that's the long answer to the short question. Yeah, I mean, we ought to be very aware of our cultural limitations.
I'm sure you've heard the quote, Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. How do you respond to those who may agree with you in principle of the need for a democratic state in Afghanistan, but think that it's an impossible task?
Well, Afghanistan is also the creation of empires. I mean, if you take the case everyone probably does remember, the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, great cultural treasure of humanity, by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, at the urging of Al-Qaeda, in fact, at the urging of Osama bin Laden, because these amazing monuments were not Islamic, because they testified to the fact that Afghanistan is the creation of Greeks, Macedonian Greeks actually, Alexander the Great's army, Hindus, there are many Christians, Buddhists, and so on. That couldn't have happened without the clash of, or the meeting point, the symbiosis of empires. So it's a truism to say this. In fact, the British once lost an entire army in Afghanistan. I mean, literally only one person came back, a doctor, I've forgotten his name, from Jalalabad. But they were able quite easily, not long after that, to restore their power in Afghanistan, to redraw the boundaries, I think, in the Durand Line, probably in a bad way. But nonetheless, it's not true to say that no one's ever succeeded in making a difference from the outside in Afghanistan, or indeed in India, which is what this was part of. India, you could say, was a graveyard of empires. It was also the creation of the British Empire as a country, albeit at the price of partition. It's a bit like saying democracy is not for export. Yes, it is. I mean, the French monarchy wasn't democratic, but without French weaponry there would have been no American Revolution. You'd never have heard of Thomas Jefferson if it wasn't for King Louis. So, history is ironic, and slogans of this kind have very little use in understanding them. In fact, they're of no use at all. The Russians, though, it's true, until the huge mistake that Brezhnev made in the late 70s, had consciously stayed out of Afghanistan. They thought the great historical lesson was, don't ever put your own soldiers in there. And, okay, everyone should bear that in mind, yes.
How do you see the conflict with Islamic jihadism ending? Do you see any historical analogies? Or
Yes, all jihads have always failed. Either they've been defeated or they've collapsed inwardly because of the impossibility of what they demand. Currently, the great demand of the jihadists, the one thing on which they all agree, Al-Qaeda or not, is on the restoration of the caliphate, the old Muslim empire. Incidentally, those who think these people are anti-imperialists are wrong precisely to that extent. They not only want an empire, they want an old one back, which is even more reactionary than wanting a new one. Well, what happened to the last one? Why does bin Laden say everything went wrong in 1918? Because it did. Because the Turkish Empire allied itself with German militarism, declared it a holy obligation of all Muslims to take Germany's side in the First World War. Big, big mistake. Hoped they would get the Muslims of India to rise against the British Empire. They didn't. Ended up not just losing the war, but losing their caliphate. They haven't got over that. So it's reassuring to know that what they demand is impossible. They couldn't get it, even if we wanted them to have it, even if we thought maybe that would shut them up. They still can't have it. If they had it, they couldn't run it. You can't run anything like a modern society out of one book and its barbaric precepts. You can't run a modern society, or even a pre-modern one, really, if you deny yourself the talents of half your population, the female half, and so forth. And there's no real religion, furthermore, can't define a nationality. I mean, the only real attempt in the 20th century to create a state based on Islam was Pakistan. It was a failed state in every possible definition of that word, and slaughtered half its own people in Bangladesh. People forget this. Fell apart, is falling apart now, because there's nothing that gives enough commonality between a Baluchi, a Punjabi, a Kashmiri. The fact that they think the same religion. No. Anyway, which version of Islam is it going to be? I can think of 5, none of which would work, all of which hate each other. So no, their defeat is inevitable. It's just going to be very painful and boring, so I have to do it. And it will involve us saying just one thing that they say, only one. we understand this bit about being offended and having unalterable convictions. We can be offended too, and we also have principles that we would never change.
Right.
I'd like to hear a bit more of that.
Changing tracks a little bit. Do you believe in some kind of free will, or do you subscribe to determinism, incompatibilism?